Crispin had never been described as a morning dragon. In fact, he had never been described as a morning anything. Whenever a new day dawned, Crispin was usually the last one to open his eyes, sometimes missing breakfast entirely. He lived in a rocky alcove high above a deep valley, where the sun's first light would peek around the mountains and illuminate the sky in dreamy pink and orange hues. Yet Crispin rarely caught sight of any sunrise. Instead, he'd be curled in a scaly ball, snoring so loudly that passing seagulls swerved to avoid his echoing roars. Other dragons in the region poked fun at this habit of his, but Crispin's snoring was as much a part of him as his gleaming emerald scales. Today was supposed to be different, or so Crispin had promised himself. He had a flight lesson scheduled at the Dragon's Peak Academy, the local institution where young dragons learn the fine art of taking off and landing without flattening a small village or themselves in the process. Crispin's instructor, an older dragon named Astraeus with shimmering silver scales, had circled the date on the training calendar in bright red ink. Missing one of Astraeus's lessons was never advised, as the old dragon was infamous for issuing long lectures on responsibility and discipline. Crispin had vowed he would wake up on time, be punctual, and prove to everyone at the academy and to himself that he wasn't just some lazybones who dozed his life away. But Crispin had made similar promises before. His cozy nest in the cavern was piled with plush blankets taken from travelers' campsites, old tattered quilts from rummage sales, and warm, straw-filled mats from the academy's storerooms. If Crispin was missing from class, you could usually find him in that nest, curled upside down with his stubby forelegs folded over his pudgy belly. That morning, Crispin's contented snores rumbled in and out of the cave, rattling stalactites and sending tiny pebbles skittering across the floor. Despite the fact that a new significant day had arrived, Crispin was deep in slumber, dreaming vividly of a buffet stacked with roasted sheep, sizzling boar, and huge vats of sweet berry sauce. In his dream, Crispin was a celebrated guest at the grand buffet, wearing a garlic crown and serenaded by minstrels. As he reached for the succulent roast, a gigantic alarm bell replaced the minstrel's tune. It was the school's morning trumpet, reverberating across the mountains to announce that flight lessons would begin in exactly 5 minutes. Of course, Crispin kept dreaming right through it, seamlessly turning the clanging into the sound of metal platters clashing together, calling him to the feast rather than to the training grounds. Meanwhile, at the academy, Astraeus was clearing his throat, scanning the sky for tardy dragons, and rehearsing a stern frown. Finally, Crispin's cavern shook with such force that he cracked open an eye. The academy's second trumpet blast boomed across the valley, rattling Crispin's nest. He blinked slowly, inhaling a massive yawn that blew a piece of quilt off his snout. Then he noticed how bright his cave was. Surely that meant it was hours past dawn. Confusion gripped him. Within seconds, his half-asleep brain reminded him, flight lesson. He leapt so quickly from his nest that he swallowed a mouthful of feathers from a pillow, stumbling forward in a flurry of blankets. Groaning, Crispin coughed them up, then peered out of the cave, squinting in the bright sunlight. Indeed, it was already well into the morning. "Oh no! Oh no," he muttered, claws scraping the stony floor as he scrambled to collect what he needed. Crispin's usual routine involved a leisurely wake-up, an extended breakfast, and maybe even a short post-breakfast nap. Skipping these steps was unthinkable. But skipping out on Astraeus's lesson was more unthinkable still. He bolted for the cave entrance, wings flapping in disorganized panic, trying to coax them into readiness. They flopped about as though they had minds of their own, refusing to snap into flight formation. Crispin grumbled under his breath. "You had one job, Wings. Don't fail me now." He spread them wide, hoping for a swift and dignified takeoff. Instead, he only succeeded in somersaulting frontways down the slope, bouncing off boulders and over a grassy ledge. With each bounce, Crispin let out an undignified yelp. A family of goats grazing nearby watched him tumble to a stop, cheeks red beneath green scales. He gave the goats a sheepish grin, no pun intended, and flapped his wings again, determined to catch at least one gust that would carry him over the academy's courtyard. After a few sloppy beats, he managed to gain altitude. He soared forward, zigzagging over the valley like a drunken hummingbird, the flight path of a dragon who most certainly missed basic stretching exercises. By the time Crispin reached the academy, the other dragons were assembled in neat rows on a wide rocky plateau. Astraeus stood in front of them, pacing back and forth on all fours. His silver scales glinted in the sunlight, and the wispy crest atop his head stood upright, a sign of mild irritation. Without even looking up, Astraeus declared, "You're late, Crispin." The older dragon had known Crispin's presence by the clumsy flap of his wings and the swirl of dust he kicked up on landing. It didn't help that Crispin arrived with a thunderous crash, skidding right into a clump of brush at the edge of the plateau. Apologizing profusely, Crispin extricated himself in a tangle of leaves, bowing repeatedly to his instructor, all the while ignoring the snickers of his classmates. "Apologies," Crispin gasped. I overslept. Again." He cringed, expecting a dramatic sigh or a lecture about how a real dragon rose with the sun, eager to sharpen claws on mountain rock and test out their wings in the crisp dawn air. But Aster's expression was more resigned than angry. He motioned Crispin into formation before giving the instructions for the day's lesson, practicing banked turns mid-sleet, diving at precise angles, and controlling tail movement to ensure stability during a quick descent. After delivering his instructions, Astraeus turned a keen gaze upon Crispin. "Let's see," he said, "whether you're ready, even if your mind still seems half asleep." The group took off in an orchestrated flurry of wings, each dragon trying to demonstrate the skill and grace that flight mastery required. Crispin's classmates stretched their wings to full span, soared high, and executed neat arcs in the sky before gliding downward. Crispin followed, doing his best to mimic their movements. He soon discovered that a rushed morning, combined with zero warm-up time, was not exactly conducive to fluid flight. His left wing seized up in a cramp, sending him veering to the side in an ungainly spiral. Resembling a massive leaf caught in a whirlwind, Crispin flailed desperately, clawing at the air until he managed to level out just above a jagged cliff. "Control the tail, Crispin," bellowed Astraeus from above. Crispin tried, but his tail insisted on having its own party behind him, flapping about so wildly that a pair of passing hawks did a double take. Crispin, having just escaped the spiral, was so relieved he forgot to keep his altitude. He found himself sinking rapidly, and with a new wave of panic, he flapped like mad. This only made him bounce up awkwardly, sending him straight toward one of his classmates, who was practicing a slow glide. The two nearly collided, but Crispin threw himself to the side at the last moment, being head over heels before finally crash landing in a small clearing near the academy's stable. The bright red roofing rattled. Crispin lay in an ungainly heap, gasping for breath. When Astraeus arrived, gliding down gracefully, Crispin already felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment. He expected a blast of anger, but heard only a chuckle. The older dragon folded his wings neatly at his sides. "That was definitely something," Astraeus said wryly. "I think you should take a break and walk it off. Try to rejoin once you've caught your breath and gotten your bearings." Crispin nodded fervently, relieved he wasn't in disastrous trouble yet. He lumbered behind a boulder where a trickling mountain spring offered cool water and a place to dust off. As Crispin slurped greedily from the spring, he heard a voice behind him. "Tough morning, Crispin." It was Floria, a bright blue dragon known for her energetic personality and impeccable attendance. Even now, she looked as though she'd tackled 20 errands before breakfast and still had energy for more. She dipped a claw in the spring and splashed Crispin's muzzle lightly, giggling as he blinked in surprise. "Tougher than usual," Crispin admitted between gulps. "I tried to wake up early, I swear, but the blankets were just too comfortable. And I kind of didn't hear the trumpet until it was almost too late." He sank down onto the pebbles, flipping one of the smooth stones between his claws. Floria settled beside him, her wings tucked neatly. "You know," she offered, "you might try some techniques to help yourself wake up, like going to bed earlier, or setting up alarms around your cave, or maybe ask the early bird dragons to give you a nudge at dawn." Crispin made a face at the dawn suggestion, remembering the sting of being yanked out of sleep. But he had to concede it was better than humiliating himself every flight lesson. "I'll think about it," he said, mustering a small smile. "Thanks, Floria." Once Crispin's heart rate had calmed and he felt less wobbly, he decided to give the exercises another try. Floria joined him in re-entering the skies, and Crispin took it slowly this time, focusing on holding a steady beat of his wings. For a few blissful minutes, he managed not to plummet like a stone. He even achieved a modest but respectable maneuver, a slight bank to the left, though he wobbled a bit in the execution. He couldn't help but grin. Sure, he wasn't graceful, but at least he wasn't crashing into the school's stable roof again. Nearby, Astraeus observed, nodding sully in approval. After the lesson ended, Crispin trudged back home, tail dragging through the dust. The relief of surviving the morning's fiasco was mingled with a lingering sense of guilt. He had promised himself that this time would be different, that he wouldn't let everyone down. So much for good intentions. He navigated the rocky ledge to his cave, half tempted to dive into that nest of pillows again. Yet he felt a small surge of resolve. Maybe it was time he made a change. If he truly wanted to learn to fly, really fly, he needed discipline. And discipline, Crispin realized with a shudder, was going to require trading in a bit of that beloved sleep. He tried implementing a plan that very evening. Instead of lazing around after dinner and letting himself drift off in a leisurely snack-induced haze, Crispin forced himself through some wing stretches. He flapped softly at first, counting each beat until his arms felt loose and limber. Then he practiced tucking in his limbs neatly, rolling back and forth on the ground to develop better muscle memory for mid-air maneuvers. While doing so, Crispin accidentally rolled onto a sharp rock, and his pained yelp echoed through the cavern. Undeterred, he pressed on, though each subsequent flop to the cave floor was accompanied by a muffled groan. Crispin set a few logs in a circle near the cave entrance, intending to light a small fire that would keep him awake longer so he could do more wing stretches. But as soon as the flames danced and crackled, Crispin felt their comforting warmth pulling him toward restful slumber. He pulled his eyelids open wide, shaking his head violently to keep from dozing off. With a desperate last resort, Crispin rose to his feet and walked in circles around the fire, chanting, stay awake," as though repeating the words would bolster his willpower. The attempt lasted 20 minutes. After that, Crispin sank onto his nest, fully intending just to rest his eyes for a moment. He was out cold seconds later, drooling softly onto his favorite quilt. The next morning, Crispin jerked awake at dawn's first glimmer, or rather, he sprang upright because something slimy and wet splattered across his snout. He wiped his face, blinking in confusion, then peered downward. A large frog, courtesy of a stork that had flown in by mistake, was flopping about in front of him. The stork had apparently thought Crispin's nest looked like a perfect spot to drop its catch. Disgusted, but also strangely grateful for the unexpected wake-up call, Crispin turned to watch the sunrise. Normally, he would have scowled and rolled back over, but with flight class looming, Crispin figured it best to embrace the odd turn of events. He hopped to his feet, shook off the frog slime, and did some quick wing stretches. This time, he felt, well, maybe not fresh as daisies, but less like a boulder with scales. Flying toward the academy courtyard, Crispin hummed a little tune in his throat. His wings still weren't particularly graceful, but at least they felt more awake. Landing without incident, Crispin even had enough time to chat with Floria and share a hunk of roasted venison before lessons began. Astraeus, impressed that Crispin had arrived on time, gave a brisk nod. "Glad you could join us for the entirety of today's lesson," the instructor teased, and Crispin offered a sheepish grin. "Let's see if we can build on yesterday's progress." The dragons soon took to the air. The exercises that day involved swooping at a downward angle, then pulling up sharply to test the core and tail strength. Crispin's first few attempts were more flops than swoops, and his dives lacked the precision of his peers. He ended one dive with a graceless belly slide across the grass, collecting leaves and dirt in his scales. But Crispin persevered, remembering to breathe deeply between each attempt. He repeated the dive over and over, gradually gaining confidence. During one particularly dogged attempt, Crispin angled himself downward, accelerating as the wind whistled past his ears. He fought the urge to panic at the speed, instead focusing on the angle of his wings. Then he pulled up with a whoosh, arching his back to stabilize. For a breathtaking moment, Crispin soared horizontally mere feet above the ground, feeling a gush of triumph. It only lasted a couple heartbeats, but Crispin whooped loudly enough that several field mice scurried into their burrows. Astrius looked on from overhead, a small grin twitching at the corners of his snout. Crispin might have been late to every lesson so far, but something had changed today. He was present, alert, and giving it his best shot. Still euphoric from that small success, Crispin landed for a break. Feeling the usual burn in his wing muscles, he spotted a curious sight. A baby phoenix, perched on a stump, fluffing its flaming plume in the breeze. Phoenix and dragon relations around these parts were friendly if distant, and Crispin, curious, approached to say hello. The phoenix chick let out a tiny chirp that sounded suspiciously like laughter. Crispin cocked his head. "You think that was funny, huh? My fancy new moves?" The chick chirped again, bouncing on the stump as if applauding. Amused, Crispin twirled in a silly circle like a dancer, ignoring the fleeting embarrassment. If a baby phoenix found him entertaining, that was worth something. He felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see Astraeus. The old dragon's expression was amused. "I see you're impressing the local wildlife now," he remarked, then gestured toward the sky. "Shall we continue? Try focusing on your tail control during the dive. Let it guide you gracefully instead of flailing." Crispin nodded, his confidence rekindled. He took off with renewed determination. Amazingly, each launch grew smoother, each bank turn a bit more controlled. Crispin discovered that if he tightened his midsection, held his tail at just the right angle, and timed his wing beats carefully, his descent felt both stable and exhilarating. After the session concluded, Astraeus called Crispin aside. "This was good work today," he admitted. "I can see you're making an effort to be on time in practice. Don't lose that momentum." Crispin bobbed his head eagerly. "I won't, I promise. I just need to figure out a system to keep me from dozing all morning." Astrius flicked his tail as though to say, "That's up to you," and soared away to evaluate the next group of students, assembling for advanced maneuvers. Encouraged, Crispin decided to create a foolproof plan to ensure he never again overslept and missed a lesson. He spent the next afternoon gathering materials from the forest. A couple of sturdy branches, some vines, and a few hollow gourds he found near the riverbank. Then, back in his cave, Crispin set about constructing a contraption. He fastened the gourds atop a beam balanced on rocks so that, if jostled, they might clunk noisily against the cave walls. Next, he rigged the beam to a vine attached to the cave entrance. The idea was that when the morning sun rose, an angled mirror placed at the entrance would reflect a ray of light onto a piece of parchment Crispin had coated with a pungent goo, courtesy of some swamp creatures. As the goo slowly heated, it would droop and tug the vine, which would tilt the beam, and the falling gourds would create a raucous clamor. In theory, Crispin would be jolted awake by the racket. It was a complicated plan, but Crispin believed it was the best way to fight his unstoppable slumber. Pleased with his invention, Crispin took care to go to bed earlier. He dreamt of gliding across pink-hued skies, no longer plagued by images of missed lessons or scolding instructors. Morning came, and Crispin was awakened by a thunderous banging in his cavern. The gourds had fallen spectacularly, rolling around and smashing into each other. The noise was so sudden that Crispin jerked up, letting out an alarmed roar. For a moment, he forgot the contraption's existence and wheeled around, thinking he was under attack. But once realization hit, Crispin burst out laughing so hard that tears pricked his eyes. His ridiculous contraption worked! Eagerly, Crispin burst from his cave at sunrise, soared across the valley with a sense of purpose, and arrived at flight lessons before Floria, before half the class, and even before Astraeus himself. When the silver dragon arrived, Crispin was already doing wing stretches, determined to make up for all the time he'd lost. Astraeus rewarded him with a rare but genuine smile. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise," he commented, scanning Crispin with an appraising gaze. "How are you feeling this morning?" Crispin grinned from ear to ear. Ready, that day's lesson. Involved flying in formation with partners while practicing synchronized moves, shifting positions seamlessly, spiraling side by side, and diving in mirrored arcs. It was advanced enough that Crispin, in his typically scattered state, would have found it nearly impossible. But Crispin gave it his all, and though he fumbled a few times, he managed to stay mostly in sync with Floria. They soared in tandem, Crispin occasionally glancing her way to match the angle of her wings. Their tailspins produced swirling gusts that whooshed across the plateau, scattering leaves and making younger dragons squeal with excitement. During one synchronized roll, Crispin discovered a rhythm between his wing beats and Floria's. Where Crispin needed a powerful push, she paused, guiding his movements into a smoother flow. Where Floria needed an extra burst, Crispin tried to time his spiral to channel the wind toward her wings. Although a bit sloppy, it was cohesive enough that Estrella let out an audible harumph of approval. By the session's end, Crispin felt more exhilarated than exhausted. Lining up with the rest of the class, Crispin observed the subtle nods from some of the older students, acknowledging his improvement. Floria nudged him cheerfully, her turquoise eyes shining. "You see what you can do with a little less sleep?" she teased, and Crispin grinned, thoroughly proud of himself. That afternoon, Crispin decided he had earned a well-deserved break. But instead of collapsing into a day-long slumber, he flew down to the glen where the baby phoenix had perched the previous day. Spotting the chick in the branches of a willow tree, Crispin performed an impromptu aerial dance, culminating in a rolling flourish that made the phoenix chick clap its tiny wings. Crispin landed gracefully, gave a mock bow, and sighed contentedly. He still adored sleeping, but the satisfaction of actually learning to fly with competence, maybe even style, was fueling a new kind of excitement within him. He spent the rest of the day forging a new routine: manageable naps rather than marathon snoozes, mindful practice rather than rushed flailing, and a healthy balance between rest and action. He also tinkered a bit more with his gourd-based alarm contraption, making sure no future collisions would send them rocketing dangerously close to his nest. Beyond that, Crispin even asked the stork, the same one that had dropped a frog on his nose, if it wouldn't mind tapping on the edge of the cave at dawn, just in case his device failed. Over time, Crispin's classmates noticed a difference. Where once Crispin had yawned through half the lesson and crashed out of the sky, he now soared with increasing confidence. There were still occasional mishaps, like when Crispin got a vine tangled around his tail after landing too near a patch of wild undergrowth, but these incidents became less catastrophic and more comedic. Astraeus, though still known for his strictness, had softened considerably toward Crispin. The old dragon would occasionally remark about Crispin's improvement in front of the entire class, and Crispin, though embarrassed by the attention, felt an unmistakable happiness welling in his scaled chest. He finally felt like he belonged among these diligent flyers. A few weeks later, the Academy hosted a small exhibition for families and local dignitaries to observe the young dragon's progress. Crispin was assigned to a group demonstration, working with Floria and two others on a synchronized flight pattern that featured a dramatic final flourish. In the past, Crispin would have dreaded such a performance, certain he'd belly flop or oversleep and miss the entire show. But on the morning of the exhibition, Crispin's invention clanged him awake at first light. He calmly ate breakfast, warmed up his wings, and arrived at the courtyard before nearly anyone else. The air buzzed with anticipation as local villagers and visiting dragons took their seats along the cliffside. When Crispin joined the formation, he sought out Floria's reassuring smile. Then, with a celebratory trumpet blast from the Academy, they all took flight together. Crispin felt a steady confidence in the beats of his wings. The squad ascended in a graceful arc, forming a tight diamond shape in the azure sky. They performed their choreographed loops and dives, Crispin exhilarated by the swirl of wind beneath him. Finally, they executed the grand flourish. Crispin and Floria soared skyward, crossing paths just as their wingmates looped around from behind, creating a twisting figure eight. The crowd below oohed in delight. Crispin dove sharply, pulling up at precisely the right moment, and the formation glided smoothly to a landing. Applause echoed off the surrounding cliffs, the thunder of it vibrating Crispin's chest. He stood among his fellow dragons, panting from exertion but grinning wildly. For once, Crispin felt fully awake to the moment, present and proud of what he'd accomplished. Classes ended that day with hearty congratulations from Astraeus, who for once made no mention of tardiness, laziness, or the importance of punctuality. "Well done, Crispin," was all he said, and it was the best compliment Crispin had ever received. That evening, Crispin tucked himself into his nest with a contented sigh. Sure, he still adored naps. Having a cozy cave and a mountain of blankets was as delightful as ever. But Crispin had learned something crucial. By tempering his lazy side just a bit, he had unlocked a world of possibilities in the skies. He no longer dreaded the academy or braced himself for another humiliating day. Instead, he dreamed of the next morning's lesson, feeling that little current of excitement in his stomach, knowing that if he wanted to, with just a little less sleep and a little more determination, he could soar higher than he ever had before. And for Crispin, that made all the difference.